Part 5. Madrid to Rome, the alley and the ashes. The train rolled into Madrid just past midnight. The kind of hour where even shadows seem tired and the silence in the carriage grows heavy with unspoken thoughts. I was bound for Prague, or so I thought, but something inside me shifted as the train slowed beneath the amber glow of the Madrid station. Maybe it was the echo of Elizabeth's voice, or the way the air tasted like something unfinished. Whatever it was, I got off. The platform was nearly empty, my breath visible in the crisp night. I hadn't booked a room. I hadn't planned a thing. I just walked, letting my boots ring out across quiet cobblestones, looking for somewhere to exist until morning. The streets felt unfamiliar, even by the standards of a traveler. There's a kind of stillness cities have at that hour, restless but hushed. I passed shuttered cafes, stray cats watching from windowsills, and a man sweeping the sidewalk like he was trying to erase the past. I turned down a narrow street, hoping it would lead somewhere brighter, warmer. That's when they found me. 3 men, hooded, rough around the edges. Not old, not young. Just worn. They stepped out of a doorway like smoke, like they'd always been there, waiting. They didn't threaten me outright. Just circled. Asked for a cigarette. Asked where I was going. Asked if I had money. Their voices didn't rise, but something in them coiled tight. I hesitated. I should have kept walking. One of them reached for my backpack. I resisted. Stupidly. Instinctively. I pulled back. The next moment, a shove. Then a hand in my coat. Then tension in the air like it might snap. I said, "Don't," though I barely recognized my own voice. It got messy. A scuffle. My notebook fell open on the pavement. The compass clinked against the stone. And then a voice cut through the alley like a blade. "Enough." The others froze. Turned. A 4th figure stepped into view, tall, leather coat, beard flecked with gray. He walked slowly, deliberately, like he knew exactly how this would end. The man who had my backpack let it go. The new figure looked at me, not hostile, not friendly. Just measured. "You look lost," he said. I didn't answer. He turned to the others. "He's not the one. Let's go." There was a pause. Tension. Then the others faded back into the shadows. The one in the leather coat stepped closer and picked up my notebook. He thumbed through a page. "You write?" "Sometimes." He handed it back. "Come on. Safer where there's company." I should have said no. Should have turned and walked the other way. But fear has strange gravity. I followed him. His name was Eric. They called him Juez, the judge. The unspoken leader of that ragtag band. But when he spoke to me, it was without menace. Just curiosity. He led me through a maze of alleys until we reached a squat, forgotten building. The stairwell echoed as we climbed, the steps coated in dust and time. Their lair was an abandoned apartment with cracked tile floors, broken furniture, and cigarette smoke that lived in the walls. There were signs of life, blankets, candles, an old radio playing something slow and Spanish. Eric poured 2 glasses of something that smelled like firewood and regret, handed me one, and sat across from me on a milk crate. "You're not from here," he said. "No. Just passing through." He raised an eyebrow. "Madrid doesn't let people just pass through." We drank. And talked. His story came in fragments, like memories he was still deciding whether to keep. Once a tech entrepreneur. Startup scene. Barcelona and Berlin. Apps, investors, magazine spreads. A future paved in gold. Then came the bets. Poker mostly. Then sports. Then markets. Harmless at first. Then not. What he lost in money, he lost twice in trust. "You think you're smarter than the table until it teaches you otherwise," he said, refilling our glasses. By the time I saw it, I'd burned through every rope. He spoke of sleeping in airports, of lying to friends, of the night he woke up on a beach in Alicante with no shoes and a note in his pocket that simply read, "This was your last chance. I used to dream of building something that lasted." he said, leaning back. Now I just try not to disappear. I told him about Elizabeth. About the compass. About the cities and the ache that chased me across them. He didn't flinch. Didn't pity. Grief's a funny mirror, he said. Makes you see yourself in everyone else's wreckage. He stood, stretched, handed me a threadbare blanket. Couch is yours tonight. Won't be pretty, but it won't be empty. Sleep, Poda. Even the broken get to rest. I laid down and stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the radio. I didn't know if I'd made a mistake coming here, or if this, too, was something the road needed me to find. Then I closed my eyes. And for the first time in days I slept. The arena and the widow. I woke to sunlight pushing through the grime-streaked window, the air heavy with yesterday's smoke and something faintly floral. Jasmine, maybe, or a memory pretending to be one. Eric was gone. A half-burned cigarette smoldered in the ashtray beside a cracked mug of coffee that wasn't mine. Someone had draped a coat over me during the night. I left without a word. No one stopped me. Madrid by morning felt like a different city. Loud, hungry, beautiful in the way worn-out things are beautiful. I walked aimlessly, unsure if I was searching for something or just trying to feel my legs beneath me again. Street cleaners swept up last night's remnants. Bodegas opened their shutters like eyelids adjusting to light. I passed faces that didn't see me and others that saw too much. Then I saw it, a poster flapping on a rusted gate. Corrida de Toros, Hoy and Las Ventas. A bullfight. I should have kept walking. Elizabeth hated bullfights. Said they were cruel poetry. Said she never understood how anyone could cheer for blood. And yet, the way she said it, her voice quiet, her hands curled around tea, there was something in her eyes that lingered. A kind of reverent fear. Too much rage in one place, she'd said once. But also, too much beauty. I bought a ticket. Las Ventas swelled with voices and dust. The sun bore down like judgment. Vendors hawked peanuts and horchata, children waved plastic flags, and old men leaned into shadows as if they were listening for ghosts. I climbed the stone steps, found a seat high up where the crowd became a tide. The arena felt ancient. Sacred in a way I didn't expect. The kind of place where time folds. Where grief could sit beside glory and not apologize for either. The bull entered first. Massive and gleaming, its muscles taut with tension. The matador followed, a splash of crimson and gold, posture like poetry mid-sentence. What happened next felt less like combat, and more like a conversation. Each movement deliberate, full of heat and silence. Death moved in circles. The crowd watched like worshippers. The sun fell directly across my lap, and I remembered Elizabeth telling me about Spanish light. That it didn't warm, it confronted. That it burned its way into your memory. When the kill came, it was fast. The bull dropped to its knees, and something in me tightened. The cheers erupted around me, a wave I didn't ride. I didn't clap. Neither did the woman next to me. She wore black. Not mourning exactly, something more permanent. Her face was lined but striking, her hair pinned back with the kind of care that comes from routine, not vanity. Her hands rested still in her lap, not clenched, not loose, just remembering. You come here often? I asked, not expecting an answer. Every time, she said, her eyes still on the ring. He died here. She meant her husband. I didn't ask how I knew. Matador? She nodded. Javier. 10 years now. I'm sorry. Don't be. This place is the last thing he ever asked me to remember. We talked for a while, small words amid the noise. She told me his last fight was swift, strange. The bull turned too soon. Caught him in the ribs. The crowd screamed. He waved from the ground, blood in his throat. He looked for her. I wasn't ready, she said. But I was watching. I always watched. Even when I begged him to stop. She told me Javier had been born for it. That his father was a tailor who sewed matador costumes. That he grew up around silk and sequins, learning that beauty could be dangerous and danger could be worshipped. He was never arrogant, she said. But he was luminous. And luminance draws everything: adoration, envy, tragedy. After the crowd thinned, she invited me for lunch. Her restaurant, El Silencio Rojo, sat tucked between shuttered shops and laundry lines. It smelled like grilled peppers and home. Inside, flamenco hummed softly, and the chairs didn't match. I liked it instantly. She poured us red wine, told me about their travels, Mexico, Morocco, a summer in southern France. But always back to Spain. Always back to Madrid. He called the arena his cathedral, she said. But he found his peace near Barcelona. There's a place there, by the coast. Artists. Writers. People who've lost things. He said it was the only place he could breathe. She told me they had once made a pact to retire there. Open a small gallery. Maybe a studio where they teach children to paint, to dance, to fight with grace instead of blades. He never got the chance, she said. But maybe you should. Her voice cracked there. Just once. I asked her where. She pulled out a napkin. Drew a crooked coastline, a star, a name. Go. Stay if you need. It's the kind of place that lets you leave differently than you arrived. There was a small hostel just up the street. She called ahead. Said I was a friend. I thanked her. For the wine. For the story. For the map. She smiled as I left. Tell the sea I said hello. And so I went. The cove and the compass. I woke with a dry throat and a craving for coffee. The hostel room was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels borrowed rather than owned. As I stirred the instant grounds Amelia had left for guests in a chipped ceramic mug, the memories of yesterday returned in a slow, steady wave. The sun over Las Ventas, Amelia's voice, her husband's ghost sewn into every word. The napkin sketch she'd handed me lay beside my bag. I unfolded it again, tracing the lines she'd drawn, a cove, a coastline, a name I hadn't spoken out loud yet. I decided then. I needed to see it. I packed up, walked to the nearest station, and bought a one-way ticket. Barcelona bound, though I didn't know where exactly I'd end up. Just that something was waiting there. Maybe a silence, maybe a spark. The train ride toward Barcelona was slow, like the land was trying to keep me a little longer. I watched as the plains of Spain rolled by in layers of ochre and rust, olive groves stretching like old secrets, wind turbines turning lazily like thoughts I hadn't finished. The napkin with Amelia's sketch stayed folded in my back pocket, warm from body heat, soft at the edges. I must have unfolded and refolded 20 times. When I finally arrived, the sun was already beginning to sink. I transferred to a bus, then another, then walked. It felt less like traveling and more like following the memory of someone else's dream. The place Amelia described wasn't marked by signs or tourist banners. It wasn't in a guidebook. It was the kind of place you find only if you need to. There were no gates. No front desk. Just a sign half swallowed by ivy, Espacio Azul. The blue space. It sat on a bluff above the sea, old stone buildings, wide courtyards littered with chairs that didn't match, and people who moved like the world would wait for them. Painters under trees. A woman playing cello to no one in particular. A young man asleep in a hammock with a pencil tucked behind his ear. No one asked who I was. No one asked what I was doing there. It was the first time since Elizabeth's death that I didn't feel like I was interrupting something. I found a spot near the edge of the cliff, where the sea crashed and retreated like breath. I opened my notebook. And I wrote. For hours. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the light turned lavender, until the ocean was nothing but sound. I wrote about the bandits and the night with Eric. About Amelia and the echo of grief inside an arena built for death. About Elizabeth's laugh, the rooftop in Brooklyn, her fingers stained with cherries, the way she looked when she read aloud and forgot I was listening. I wrote the truth. Not all of it was pretty. The night arrived unnoticed. I looked up and the stars had already taken their places. Someone touched my shoulder. You're going to freeze out here, she said. She introduced herself as Ines. one of the caretakers. She had a freckled face and hair like old copper. "There's a room upstairs in the old mill," she said. "It's empty. You can stay." The bed was small, the blanket coarse, the window stuck half open with salt. But sleep came easily. And when I woke, the sea was still singing. I walked down to the shore with a thermos of coffee and sat cross-legged in the sand. Boats dotted the horizon, tiny, brave shapes breaking away from land. There was something about their defiance I admired. I remembered what Amelia had said, a place that lets you leave differently than you arrived. She was right. I didn't feel healed, but I felt moved. And that was something. I packed my things slowly, unsure where I'd go next. Then, without planning to, I wandered into the heart of Barcelona. The streets buzzed with late morning life. I let them guide me like rivers. Somewhere along the harbor, I stopped to watch the ships. That's where I met Carl. He was standing beside a weather-beaten cargo vessel, yelling at a man 3 decks up while eating a piece of bread. His beard was streaked with gray. His arms covered in sunburn and stories. "You look like you need to leave something behind," he said, squinting at me. I blinked. "Excuse me?" He laughed. "Only people who stare at the sea that long are either in love or in grief." I smiled because it was both. "I'm headed to Rome," I said. "Eventually." "Then you're in luck," he said. "We sail tonight. Not a cruise. No frills. But the deck's open, and the stars don't ask questions." His name was Carl. Born in Hamburg. Raised in wind and salt. He told me stories before I even stepped aboard, about storms in the Aegean, a wedding proposal in Malta, and the daughter who waited for him in Sardinia with pockets full of paper boats. "She builds one every time I leave," he said, "then sets them afloat when I return. Says that's how she keeps me safe." I didn't hesitate. I boarded the ship just before dusk. And we sailed. Salt days and star maps. The ship's rhythm was slow and sure, a long exhale drawn across 4 days and nights of sea. We cut through water that shifted from steel to glass, sky to mirror. There was no itinerary. No announcements. Just tide and wind and Carl's steady voice. Each morning, we rose early. Carl brewed coffee thick as ink and handed it to me with a grunt that doubled as a greeting. Then came the work, ropes to tie, canvas to check, rusted bolts to argue with. I wasn't much help at first, but Carl didn't mind. "You'll learn," he said. "Or you won't. Either way, the ocean doesn't care." By midday, the chores thinned and the stories started. Carl spoke like someone who didn't often get the chance, his voice gravel-warm, words slow but deliberate. He told me about Marta, the girl from Genoa who became his wife. How she hated the sea but married it anyway when she married him. How their daughter, Noemi, was born early during a storm, and how he still swears he felt her heartbeat before she cried. "Home," he said one evening, as we watched the sun bleed into the horizon, "is wherever she's waiting for me. Even if I'm late. Especially then." He told stories of his crew, like Amelia, the ship's cook, who once trained as a ballet dancer before trading tights for ladles. His pirouettes on rough waters are legendary. Carl chuckled. Or Dima, the quiet Ukrainian who could fix any engine but refused to speak more than 3 words at a time. He once reassembled a diesel motor using only wire, gum, and a spoon. No joke. Each sailor had a secret life, a hidden corner they carried with them beneath their calluses. Lost loves. Letters never sent. A tattoo no one else was allowed to ask about. At night, Carl brought out a deck of cards that had seen better centuries. We didn't play to win. We played to speak without pressure. To fill the space between stars. Sometimes we were quiet. And in that silence, I'd find myself watching the dark water and thinking of Elizabeth, not in grief, but in gratitude. Her voice seemed closer on the sea. Maybe because it was always moving. Maybe because so was I. On the 3rd day, a storm rolled in from the west, brief but loud, slapping the hull with rain that came in sideways. Carl steered without flinching, boots braced wide, humming something in German that sounded like an old lullaby. I helped where I could. Mostly, I just held on. When it passed, the sea glittered like it had forgiven us. That night, over a tin cup of rum, Carl told me about the first time he got lost at sea. Not directionally, existentially. I was 24. Thought I was invincible. Thought the world was mine. Then the engine failed, the radio died, and I spent 2 days drifting. Nothing but stars above, water below, and this sound in my chest I couldn't explain. Fear? I asked. No, he said. Wonder. And maybe a little bit of shame. Sometimes the sea doesn't break you. It just humbles you into listening. The next day, we fished for mackerel and cooked them over a rusted grill lashed to the deck. Amelia made a stew with garlic and saffron that tasted like something sacred. Afterward, we passed a bottle around and sang songs that didn't need words. The nights blurred into one another, moonlit swells, quiet laughter, the creak of old wood and dreams half-formed. I wrote by lantern light, scribbling fragments that made no sense until they suddenly did. Carl told me once, "The sea doesn't heal, but it listens. And sometimes that's enough." On the fourth night, we saw Rome's glow before we saw its shape. A soft blur on the horizon, like a memory approaching. Carl stood beside me, hands in his pockets, eyes squinting against the wind. "You'll be all right," he said. "You're carrying her well. Not heavy. Just close." I nodded. We docked with the dawn. And I stepped onto Roman soil with salt on my skin, a full notebook, and a heart not mended, but mending. A soft blur on the horizon, like a memory approaching. Sunlight and stories. The first thing I felt was hunger. Real, gnawing, bone-deep hunger. The kind that made every scent in the air feel like an invitation. I followed my feet through a tangle of side streets until I found a place with no name, just the smell of roasted tomatoes and garlic drifting through a half-open window. Inside it was quiet. Warm. A woman stirred something in a copper pot behind the counter, while a man shaped dough with practiced hands. I ordered without thinking, pasta, bread, olives, wine, and when the food came, I ate like I hadn't in days. I think I might have wept, just a little. After the meal, I drifted outside to a small stone bench tucked into a patch of sunlight. The sun hit my face with a gentleness that made me lean back, close my eyes, and drift. I must have dozed off, because I was woken by a voice. "You've got the look of someone who either ate very well or cried very hard." I opened my eyes. A young woman stood in front of me, apron folded over her arm, her dark hair tied back, cheeks pink from the kitchen heat. She smiled as she sat down beside me. "I'm Ariana. I just finished my shift. Didn't want to go home to silence just yet." I told her my name. We sat in comfortable quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "What brings you to Rome?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "A promise. A compass. A long, strange road." And like that, it all came out. Elizabeth. The notebook. The cities I'd carried her through. Marcus. Amelia. The sea. The salt. Carl's deck of cards and the storm that hummed like a lullaby. Ariana didn't interrupt. She listened with both ears, eyes wide, fingers laced together like she was trying to hold the weight of what I said without letting any of it drop. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. That's not just a story," she said. "That's something people need to hear. Not just me. Everyone." She looked at me, really looked, like she was seeing the outline of something I hadn't dared shape yet. "Promise me you'll tell it. Properly. Not just on benches." I nodded. I think I meant it. We sat there, letting the sun hold us for a while longer. Then Ariana asked if I wanted to see something. My favorite corner of this city, she called it. I followed her down narrow cobblestone alleys, past shuttered bookstores and balconies dripping with laundry and jasmine. We ended up at a quiet overlook near the Aventine Hill, where Rome spread out below like an open book. She sat cross-legged on the stone wall, legs dangling, wind curling around her. I stayed on the bench, notebook on my knees. This is where I come when I don't want to be found, she said. But today, I think I was meant to find you. She wasn't flirting. It wasn't that. There was something heavier in her voice, curiosity laced with something unspoken. We talked for over an hour. About food. About grief. About what it means to stay, and what it means to go. She told me her brother had died 4 years earlier. Motorcycle accident. Just 20. She stopped studying after that. Took the restaurant job to be near her mother, to stay in motion. Your story made me remember something I'd been trying not to, she said. But also, it made me feel like maybe remembering doesn't have to hurt. Before we parted ways, she wrote her number on the back page of my notebook. If you write it, she said, I want to read it. And if you don't, I want to remind you that you said you would. Then she stood, adjusted her bag, and disappeared into the streets with the ease of someone who belonged to them. I sat there long after she left. Rome glowed beneath me, slow and wide and whispering. I opened the notebook and wrote the first line of something I didn't know how to finish yet. But the line grew into a paragraph. The paragraph became a page. And soon, there was no turning back. I stayed on that bench until the sun gave way to dusk, scribbling the bones of everything I had seen, heard, and carried. That night, back at a small pensione near Trastevere, I filled 3 more pages. Then 4. Then 10. I wasn't writing to explain anymore. I was writing to remember. To preserve. To release. By dawn, I had a rough manuscript. Not perfect. Not polished. But real. I opened my email, attached the document, and typed out a message to John. Here's what I've got. The beginning, maybe. Or something like it. Tell me if it breathes. I hit send. Then I stepped outside, into the morning streets of Rome, lights spilling between buildings like a benediction. And for the first time, I wasn't carrying a story, I was sharing one. A soft blur on the horizon, like a memory approaching.